Good morning, good afternoon, dear colleagues, guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's our pleasure to welcome you to another session of Qatar Financial Center's Access Qatar series. And this edition organized in collaboration with Labuan International Business and Financial Center. My name is Jiazhong Wang. I work for the Financial Sector Office, Qatar Financial Center, and I'll be a moderator for this webinar. So Labuan and Qatar share some interesting features, both situated in a very special location, representing access to two very interesting economic blocs, the ASEAN and the GCC. So in this edition of the webinar, we will hear presentations from Labuan IBFC, QFC, and also from our partners. And they will highlight the investment opportunities in both states. And at the end of the event, we will have the roundtable discussion with our speakers. So if you have any questions, please send in your questions. So without any further ado, I would like to invite Farah Jaafar, CEO of Labuan IBFC, to tell us more about Labuan Financial Center. Please go ahead, Farah.
Thank you, Jiazhong. It's always so fantastic to see our friends at Qatar, QFC, and to have this opportunity to speak to everyone. Good morning to you, good afternoon to the ones that are watching us from Asia, and good morning to the ones in the MENA region, specifically in Qatar. This presentation and this sharing session has been long overdue, actually, and we're glad we finally got it off the ground, and thank you so much for joining us. So, you know, the aim here is for me, I'll have a colleague, Henry. Henry Chong will be coming on a little bit later, and he'll be talking about specifically the digital offering that we have in Labuan. But what I'd like to do first before that is really to talk you through what is Labuan IBFC, right? How are we positioned within the Malaysian financial ecosystem, and what can we possibly offer our friends in Qatar? So next slide, please. So first and foremost, where is Labuan? I think a lot of people are very curious about. It's an island, it's part of Malaysia, but where is it? So actually, it's important to remember that Malaysia is divided into two portions. First is the Peninsula Malaysia, where the capital Kuala Lumpur is. I hope some of you have been there. We are blessed to live in a fantastic, fantastic city. And then we have also Borneo, Malaysia. And Borneo, Malaysia is divided between three nations. So you have Brunei, Indonesia, and Malaysia. And Labuan is part of the Malaysian Borneo offering. Yeah, so part of Malaysia, we're a federal territory under the federal government of Malaysia, off the coast of Borneo. So it's an island off the coast of Borneo Island. And really, it's interesting to note, right? So when we started to do some of the work, trying to understand, trying to delve and create a future for Labuan, you have to look into the past. And when we started looking into the past, we realized that the name Labuan actually came from a very old Malay word called Labuhan, which means port. So for the longest time, Labuan has been a port of call, generally for the mariners, but in this day and age, especially for IFC users, International Financial Center users, and also actually we are home to one of Asia's deepest supply bases, deepest ports, which makes us a supply base, a natural supply base for all the oil and gas activities of the basin of near Labuan. Easy access, obviously, there are flights going into and out of Labuan from Kuala Lumpur, Kota Kinabalu. It's a small island, only 100,000 people. I mean, Malaysia is a nation of 33 million people. So you can imagine 100,000 isn't a large island at all. Yeah. Here on the map here, you can see geographically where we are located and the key economic drivers. So obviously, tourism is key. It's a beautiful island, oil and gas. Again, this is what Jiazhong was talking about earlier, about the similarities that we may have with Qatar. And of course, the IFC, which is again the similarity. Next slide, please. So we like to think ourselves as the gateway to Asia Pacific. You know, Labuan International Business and Financial Center comes under the purview of the Ministry of Finance of Malaysia, and it has been around, it was established more than 30 years ago. What is interesting about Labuan IBFC is that unlike a lot of other jurisdictions, it grew organically. It grew because the Malaysian government decided that we needed a port, a Labuan, for all our businesses, Malaysian businesses, going out into Asia. And that was 30 years ago. Since then, what has happened is Labuan IBFC has carved its name, obviously, domestically as the port of call for businesses going out of Malaysia as they internationalize into the region specifically, but more so for businesses and industries that are further away from Asia, looking for a solid home within Asia, and from there to use this base and a cost-efficient base to go out into the region. So we were set up in 1990. It's tax efficient, obviously. A substance enabling, those of you in the IFC business will know that substance is a key element now of everything that we do. So we like to think we're substance enabling, well balanced. So all the laws and the legal structures that I will highlight in a bit have been passed by the Malaysian Parliament, and they are in perpetuity. So it's not a situation where Labuan IBFC is an incentive that then has to be renewed by the ruling government. It is in perpetuity, passed by the Malaysian Parliament via acts of laws and subordinate gazette legislation as well. So adheres to all the AMLA. So, we get a lot of questions when we do these presentations, right? Because how do we then manage any potential arbitrage between Labuan IBFC, which is seen as the international offering for Malaysia, and Malaysia onshore, which is the domestic offering? And really, it's quite simple in the sense that there is no arbitrage for anti-money laundering and Amat Fuah requirements, right, between Labuan and onshore Malaysia. And I'll talk about that a little bit when we go through the acts very quickly. Next slide, please. So this is the regulator. We are regulated. So I am the CEO of Labuan IBFC Incorporated. Labuan IBFC Incorporated is a wholly owned subsidiary of the regulator, which is the Labuan Financial Services Authority, what you can see on your slide there. And the Labuan Financial Services Authority is headed by a Director General that reports directly to the Minister of Finance in Malaysia. So it's a statutory body under the purview of the Minister of Finance of Malaysia, and it ranks pari passu with all the other regulators, the financial regulators, the non-financial regulators in Malaysia under the purview of the Ministry of Finance. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So a lot of people ask us, why are we known as the mid-shore jurisdiction? And the answer can be very complicated or can be very simple. I mean, in the 4 little leaves that you have here on the slide, what I call leaves on the slide, you have the reasons why we are mid-shore, but I won't bore you through all that. What I'll talk you through is actually the practicality, I should say, the practicality of being a mid-shore center. And the practicality of being a mid-shore center then rests in the fact that we are a jurisdiction that sits within a larger jurisdiction, i.e. Malaysia onshore, and that's why we are never able to be too business friendly or less business friendly. We have to tread. There is a constant push and pull with regards to our regulations, our approach to towards business. What we'd like to think is that we have proportionality in regulation. And one of the reasons we can do that, and I think this is a benefit that also our friends in Qatar enjoy, is the fact that we deal in wholesale financial intermediation. And dealing with wholesale financial intermediation allows for proportionality in regulation, allows for a very bespoke element within our offering. And one of those things is really our digital offering, which Henry, my colleague, will talk about in a minute. So here you have part of Malaysia, conformity to international standards. And that's the other thing, that's the other trigger, right? And that is a real kicker trigger, as it were. When Malaysia is assessed by multilateral organizations like the FATF or APG, or when OECD comes in to do a peer review, we are reviewed under the purview of Malaysia. So whatever Malaysia has to adhere to at the multilateral level, so do we as that jurisdiction. That by default creates a situation that ensures we are constantly well regulated, right? And in this day and age, I can tell you there's nothing more valuable than being in a jurisdiction that is well regulated, with a reputation of robust and yet proportionality within their regulatory and supervisory framework. Next slide, please. This is the legislations, you know, and I like to say that these are the legislations. And if you look at all these different acts here, the acts here, right, under the purview of Labuan FSA, under the purview of the Inland Revenue Board, and the acts of general applications, right? And I'll go through it a little bit to explain the context of it, not specifically each piece of legislation. But what's interesting to note is that all this, if you look at this legislation as little clouds, and these little clouds kind of hover on top of the island, and this is the best way to understand how Labuan IBFC sits within Labuan, the island, while at the same time, the domestic financial regulation also applies, yeah? So I go back a little bit to talking about the competent authorities and how there is no arbitrage onshore. One of the other things that we ensure is that there are two actual competent authorities in Labuan. Number one, Labuan Financial Services Authority, our wholly owned, statutory body, as it were, right? And they are responsible with the development and the supervision and the regulation that govern within the jurisdiction on all aspects, completely all aspects. So you can see there you have the laws, the 7 laws that are regulated and supervised by Labuan FSA. Now, the other competent authority is the Malaysian Inland Revenue Board. And this is equivalent to the UK HRMC. They are our tax authority, and they have 3 specific acts, right, that govern the fiscal and taxation that operate within Labuan Island. So in total, you have 10 acts regulated by either Labuan Financial Services Authority or the Inland Revenue Board of Malaysia that govern all activities within the financial center. And then you have the point number 3, which is the bit on the right-hand side here. These are acts of general applications. And these are acts of general application that apply onshore in domestic Malaysia and apply in Labuan, Malaysia as well. So as you can see, we are very well regulated, and you know the legislation that governs the jurisdiction is extremely extensive, right? Next slide, please. Sorry, next act. Creating a complete ecosystem. So you can imagine, right, with 10 acts of parliament that govern and create the jurisdiction, we have a complete ecosystem. We have a complete ecosystem that ranges everything from IBC companies to wealth management structures like trusts and private client foundations. It's interesting to note that our friends in Qatar might be interested to know that actually we have also a foundation, an Islamic private client foundation with a Waqaf element, which is extremely unique. Insurance is an area, and insurance, reinsurance, and risk management is an area that grows leaps and bounds every year. So you can imagine that within all these different verticals, as it were, in Labuan, our license holders at the moment, we have a very, very large data set, a very large cohort of license holders. At the moment, it's more than 830 different license holders representing all these areas, right? When you look at these trust companies, which is in the middle of the slide, trust companies is a bit of a misnomer, actually. It is basically a TCSP, which is a trust and corporate service provider. And they are the ones that will guide you through your Labuan experience. We have at the moment 62 trust and corporate service companies that help us market and develop the jurisdiction. Next slide, please. So fiscal structure and corporate entity benefits. Now, the fiscal, i.e. the tax application within Labuan is simple. It's extremely simple. For all activities which are not investment holding is taxed at 3%, right? Non-trading income, there is no tax levied on non-trading income. Everything, and it's quite interesting because those of you who are IFC stalwarts would know that substance requirements that kicked in about 2 years ago have been a very it can be, I should say, a very nebulous element in the sense that, yes, do you adhere to substance in the jurisdiction that you're using? But what is sufficient substance, right, for tax purposes? And it's not so much the local tax authority that we are concerned with as much as the international multilateral assessors to ensure that the jurisdiction remains well regulated. Now, Labuan is extremely, extremely unique in this sense because we have a gazette order passed by the Malaysian government that dictates how much substance is deemed sufficient. And it's a very simple tick the box exercise that says if you have this license, this is the number of full-time employees, this is the number of domestic spend that you need to evidence in order to satisfy that you have met the substance requirements that will then lead you to enjoy the preferential tax regime, right? And this is so clear that this is one of the reasons actually that we have seen so much interest in Labuan, especially vis-a-vis license holders in the last 2-3 years. Yeah, it's important to note that if you do not either by default or by purpose meet this economic substance requirements, you fall back to the Malaysian tax rate of 24%. So you are never without. You're never thrown into the tax abyss, as it were, because you go into the Malaysian tax rate of 24%. So, you know, as you can see, Labuan is extremely unique in our offering, right? So, you know, our friends in Qatar will be very, very accustomed to exemption on withholding tax, interest, exemption from stamp duty. And what's important to remember is that a Labuan entity also does have access to most of Malaysia's 70 double taxation agreements. So Malaysia is actually signatory to more than 80 double taxation agreements. We are one of the largest trading nations in the world. And, you know, going back to remember my narrative earlier about how Labuan was set up, because of our businesses, our local domestic businesses looking to come out. This is just a validation of that. And yes, 100% foreign ownership, you know, you can choose the law that you transact with, use that you use for your commercial requirements. So you can choose the law of Qatar, for example, if both parties agree to it. And there is no limitation on any kind of currency that you can use when you transact in Labuan. So we like to think that we are, or we know actually, I should say, that we are tax neutral, fiscal, and legally agnostic, right? So it creates a very open environment from which businesses can run. Next slide, please. So we're home to numerous international banks. This is just, you know, one of those tombstone slides that you can ponder in time. Next slide, please. So I wanted to very quickly go into 2020 highlights with you, just to explain to you certain elements that we have in Labuan, our fast-growing elements. In banking, we're home to 61 banks at the moment, of which 20 are Islamic banks. We have either full-fledged Islamic banks or what we have windows, what we call Islamic windows within Islamic banks, within conventional banks to transact Islamic Islamic transactions, obviously. One of the things that we've had a lot of interest in is investment banks within Labuan. So investment banks are banks that are not part of the SWIFT network. There is no allowance for deposit taking. However, all the other banking facilities, all the other banking operations can be done by this investment bank, right? So it can, you will have subsumed within it a fund management license, a securities dealer's license, a credit token license, a booking license or a loan booking license, a capital raising license, you know, within the investment banking system license. And what's interesting is that we have a digital investment bank offering as well. Yeah. Next slide, please. Insurance. I spoke a little bit just now about insurance and risk management in Labuan. Again, out of the more than 820, 30 plus, we don't have the latest numbers, but I believe as of June it's maybe 830 or 40 license holders. More than 230 of them are within the insurance, reinsurance, and risk management. And really, this is again an organic growth, you know, and I cannot stress this enough. And one of the reasons Labuan continues to grow strength to strength is because we grew organically over the last 30 years, right? So they are they're very strong embedded value propositions within our industry verticals that allow it to grow. And I think one of the biggest benefits is that that base is quite strong. And we have a very facilitative regulator, a very forward-thinking regulator that will allow for innovation within these verticals, yeah? Insurance, 72% is from Asia Pacific. We'd really like to see a growth in that from the MENA region. Captives or self-insurance vehicles are something that we're getting to be quite well known for. One of the reasons is because we, again, started off 30 years ago organically by creating self-insurance vehicles for Malaysian corporates. That's one. So, you know, along the way, we created a lot of talent, a lot of knowledge within the jurisdiction, either in Labuan Island itself or in Kuala Lumpur, vis-a-vis these structures. So that, and also because we have such a wide array of different structures. So we have, for example, we're home to Asia's only protected cell company vehicle. And, you know, just to evidence the innovation, each cell now actually does not require regulator approval for it to be set up, right? Because this is how the regulator has decided to innovate and you know, take a leading position within that. So there's only a notification that's now required within 14 days. But of course, all submissions, all solvency requirements, all underwriting activities, all that is, you know, is sacrosanct. All that is sacrosanct, and it is all well regulated within guidance that's been issued by the regulator. Next slide, please. So this is wealth management. I spoke a little bit about Islamic wealth management earlier. We're home to active. We're home to, in total, more than 250 private client foundations, of which more than 190 are active. So setting up a foundation, a private client foundation, is an arduous task, that is for sure. But operationalizing it is even tougher. And we are proud to say that we're home to 194 of those in operations, right? We've also had trusts, so we have registered and unregistered trusts. We have, of course, a very small number of registered trusts, right? So you can see there, it's only 14, but we know for a fact that unregistered trust runs into the more than 500-600 unregistered trusts with Labuan Trust, be it trust, special trust, purpose trust, used for either wealth management or sometimes more so now actually as corporate orphan vehicles, either pre-IPO or during IPO or any other corporate vehicle, corporate exercise that needs an orphan vehicle, right? Next slide, please. So this is actually my last slide. I don't want to take too much time, and I look forward to more questions at the panel. So why would you consider Labuan IBFC? First and foremost, it's well regulated. I mean, I think in this day and age, the issue of reputational risk is something that all businesses need to consider very seriously. And the fact that we are such a well-regulated jurisdiction, cocooned within such a well-respected country that Malaysia is a perfect environment for businesses from MENA to kind of grow into Asia, yeah? So regional opportunities, obviously, you know, Asia is still, even with COVID and the pandemic that's blighted us all, is still the engine of growth for the world, really. And so what you have is a home within the world's fastest growing area, right? Efficient and flexible tax system. I spoke a little bit about our substance enabling provisions and the ease of doing business. I mean, I think kudos to the regulator for being absolutely approachable. I mean, I believe, you know, Qatar as well, along with Labuan, have a very strong business-friendly gene within the regulator. That's one way of putting it, I guess. And we facilitate businesses that want to come, or even to try and understand how the jurisdiction can assist them in their growth strategy, right? The logos below you see on this slide is really, we are recognized as members of these global organizations, whether it be GIFC or APG FATF, and of course the Islamic Financial Services Board, which is housed and homed in Malaysia, and also the International Islamic Financial Market, which is homed in the Middle East. So with that, I'd like to end my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the questions. And next, I'd like to invite Henk, who is the Managing Director, sorry, I'm going to have to read this, Managing Director and Chief of Financial Sector Office at QFC. Henk, over to you and your presentation, please. Thank you very much, everyone.
It was an amazing, energetic presentation, and it shows clearly not only your ambitions, but the ambitions of Malaysia and Labuan. And the successes. So I think that is clearly an example for many other financial centers like ourselves. So we are very happy that we have this working relationship with each other after we signed the MOU last year. Yeah, so allow me to tell a bit about Qatar. Obviously, there are many things similar, but also things different. As always, we are also a relatively small country, but that's compared to Labuan. But Labuan is part of a big state with a big population. Can I get the first slide, Chandra? So for those people who don't know where it is, and I think we become more and more visible now, the FIFA 2022 becomes clear, and people know where we are on the map. We are in the GCC, in the Gulf. We are a small peninsula, blessed with, I think, an enormous wealth of natural resources, mainly LNG, that has made this relatively small population also very rich, having the largest GDP per capita in the world, actually. It's not always spread evenly, but the country is really there to develop the whole population, including all the workers and the guests that are operating in Qatar. We have a AA- rating, which I think is pretty good compared to the peers in the region. Basically, my message is that, you know, we have a small country, but with a young population and a very tech-savvy population, and also the infrastructures in the country are pretty good, you know, with an excellent airport. Qatar Airways reaching out to, I think, 120 destinations. We have, apart from the COVID rules, we have 120 nationalities, visa on arrival. So a very welcoming atmosphere indeed. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so we are very much complementing Labuan's sphere of influence, which is Asia. So we try to position ourselves, to be fair, as the alternative financial center in the GCC. Obviously, Dubai is already very established, but we have strong relationship with many countries around us, as you can see. And now the sort of diplomatic blockade situation is over. You see a very active development of economic business again with Saudi and UAE. I think this is a clear map. The recent developments is that I see Qatar more and more expanding into Africa. I think that's an area. Central Asia, I think, is another area where we would like to develop trade relationships with. So this is a clear picture of the countries nearby, of which we have a very good relation with. Next slide, please. Yeah, so it all started, I think, relatively late for Qatar with the development of natural gas. And we have the largest proven reserves in the world of natural gas, which is partly on the ground, but also partly deep sea. And with the help of all the partners on the right side, the oil companies, Qatar has been so far the lowest producer and the most clean producer of LNG. We will see later that Qatar is investing more, and you can expect us to grow further in the production of LNG, which makes us, I think, a very stable country with a very clear financial stable forecast for decades to come. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, so then we basically go on what is Qatar apart from gas, and like many other countries that started with hydrocarbons, you know, we are trying to diversify. So here you can see the sectors that we are into and some of the developments in the country. Obviously, Doha is the capital. But Doha has different parts, and we are developing new cities like Lusail is a new development, and there also will be the stadium of the World Cup where the final will be played. The international airport is an award-winning airport, very visible for whoever crossed Qatar on its way to its final destination. We have a very modern port. We have a free zone that is developing very quickly. I think the leadership of the country, so this emir, but also the previous emir, have really invested in educational partnership. So we have, I think, in the GCC, the biggest number of international universities, and education is a key element of Qatar, and we produce yearly very well trained master and bachelor students who immediately can find work. Also very many international students, a very open society there. Next slide, please. Yes, these are some of the household names. The big names, probably you've heard about Ooredoo. They're also very active in some Asian markets. QNB is the largest bank in the Middle East. Qatar Insurance Company, largest insurance company in the Middle East, and some other names like Nakilat, for instance. They are the largest LNG carrier, and they also, probably you've seen that also in Asia, that you know, they're ordering ships in several markets in Asia, LNG carriers, because Asia is becoming the most important customer for Qatar. I would say the wind is blowing east. And that's why we have this relationship with Labuan as well. It's interesting, it's not on the list, but it's interesting that after the blockade, which, you know, basically put us in a position that Qatar had to do, manage its own resources and everything, they, for instance, have developed a dairy food producer, which is now very large and even exporting dairy products to other markets. So that is a big example on how the country is able to, even when there's pressure, difficult situations, how always to overcome these situations and get things done. I think that is a key factor of the DNA of the country. Next slide, please. Yeah, so if you look at what will define the growth of our country, we have a plan which is called the National Vision 2033 to 2030, I mean. And we are clearly executing that plan, which is diversifying the economy, next to the fact that Qatar would like to be the largest producer and the most clean producer of LNG in the world, and make sure that through all the channels and everywhere in the world, you can see Qatar investing into LNG facilities in Europe, in Russia, in Africa. So similar to what Qatar Airways is doing, you know, investing into airlines throughout the world. FIFA World Cup is obviously the biggest event, and I cannot show you, but behind me the city is ready to receive the guests, and it is clearly an amazing development that have been done over the last 5 years. It's a great city, and I hope you will all come to visit us during the World Championship. Obviously, the blockade, well, more than a diplomatic event, is over, and clearly, specifically with Saudi, the developments are very strong, and the trade, we can see it has picked up again to pre-blockade numbers. The digitalization of the country is clear. We all have 5G here. Luckily, we're sort of well organized, so our COVID numbers are low. So we have 100 cases per day, which is basically nothing. So we get back to a normal life, and it's relatively easy to come and visit us on a business visa to see if you can do business here. So all in all, I think good development, some good growth pillars, which you can make, you can benefit from. If you fit our strategy, then there's always an opportunity to find business here. Next slide, please, Yamra. So these are some of the names, probably similar to the list that Farah also showed. You know, some international names that are on our Qatar Financial Center platform, and we see a lot of interest now, specifically from the Swiss banks, to tap into the market of wealth management. The other area, we see more European, specifically French banks, who would like to be part of the LNG developments. We have many Asian banks, as you also can see here. We have recently created opportunity to also start as a rep office. So you can start with a 1 or 2 man shop, and then, you know, discover the market and try to see whether there is business. And that is a possibility that is now taken up by several European and Asian banks. Next slide, please. Yeah, so then we go back to the licensing part of our platform, and there are some similarities with Labuan, but also some differences. So our biggest competitor, if you wish, if you will, it's Dubai, which is an offshore financial center. So we have created a hybrid model. So we are an offshore and an onshore. So if you are licensed on our platform, you can do business in Qatar, which I think is a great benefit. Also, you can do business in multi-currencies, not only dollars. That is also very important. And the other thing which is important is to understand, and that is probably similar to what Labuan has, we have 2 different systems. So we have the state of Qatar with its own law, and then we have the Qatar Financial Center with its own laws. And basically, you can see it on the right side, at least for me, you can see how we are structured. So we have Qatar Financial Center, which is basically us. It's a commercial platform. We can give people, companies, a license to operate onshore, if you wish. Then we have our regulator, who will look at the regulatory aspects, specifically of the financial sector. There are some limitations there. So the banks on our platform will not have access to the payment system and always have to cooperate with local banks. Still, there is enough business for international banks. That's why they're here. We have an independent court, which is important because we have a separate legal system. And this has been tested many times. So if there is a court order, it is enforced in the state, which I think makes our system probably better than, let's say, Cayman. Let's say if somebody has a Cayman SPC and thinks, you know, well, that's fantastic because it's international and investors like Cayman structures. It would be much better to have a QFC structure, because if there's a conflict, then any legal decision or court decision can be enforced locally. I cannot see a situation where a Cayman conflict in Qatar would lead to the same enforcement. So whoever has in mind to set up certain structures, corporate structures, protected cell companies, whatever, or captive insurance, I think we are in a place to go to, and that's probably similar to what Labuan has to offer. I need to see what I missed here. No, I think it's clear. We are a UK common law-like platform, so international companies typically like us because of that similarity to UK common law. We offer the opportunity to have 100% ownership, which is also important. If you want to do business in Qatar, you always have to have a partnership or a joint venture. I think that's enough for this slide. Maybe we can move to the next. Yeah, so obviously I already said the 100% ownership. We are not a free zone, so there is tax. There is a 10% corporate tax, which I think is fair because the global tax trends are moving towards 15% anyway. There are certain tax advantages, so there's no withholding tax. You can repatriate your profits. We have certain segments that we would like to stimulate, for instance, the asset management sector, and under certain substance rules, we can allow no tax on the management fee. So that's why we see a lot of interest from asset managers and investment managers to set up here and to set up the funds here as well. Similar to Labuan, we have double taxation treaties with 80 countries, which is, I think, very good. We try to be a front runner when it comes to data protection rules, employment regulations, etc. So yeah, so we would like to be that top class financial center that we've just seen also in Labuan, and we don't compromise on that. So we are not a place where people can go and set up their money laundering operation. We are very strict. The whole country is very strict, and we don't have arbitrage with the local regulations. So what we say, Qatar deserves the best. So I would say only the professional companies will choose Qatar and Qatar Financial Center to set up operations. I think that is it. I don't think they have another slide. Maybe, Chandra, was this the last slide? No, yeah, so of course. So yeah, what do we license? So we operate as a platform, and we offer professional services companies, and you can see the type of companies that we target, the possibility to set up. And we have certain permitted categories. In general, you could say that we are more business to business focused, and that the only retail sector that is allowed is the insurance sector. So we see health insurance here dealing with the retail. Otherwise, it will be difficult to deal directly with retail because that is under the control of the central bank. We have created a fintech services provider solution for fintech companies that partner with the financial sector and offer solutions which can be used by retail users as well, of course. I think that's in a nutshell. If you want to know more, please reach out to us. We typically would like to help people that would like to come here, provide them access to the market, ask us any question. We try to come up with an answer. We have some studies on certain sectors which we can share with you. We would like you to be successful. Some spaces are overcrowded. Let's say, for instance, the payment fintech space. I would not advise you to come here. It's a relatively small market. But anything other like artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, wealth tech, all kind of developments on innovation side, you're more than welcome to set up your team here in Qatar. We can also provide, if big numbers are involved our investment promotion agency to make it even more attractive. I think this was my last slide. If there's another slide, then I think I've said enough. So these are the numbers of Jiazhong and myself. And I would like to hand over to Henry Chong right now to basically showcase a Labuan company. And after that, we will showcase a Qatar company on the platform. Good luck, Henry.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Henry Chong, and I'm the CEO of Fusang. Fusang builds digital asset infrastructure to empower what we call security tokens, the idea of using the same underlying blockchain technology that powers assets like Bitcoin, but to represent real-world assets like shares, bonds, and funds. Our belief, our vision is that people should be able to invest in companies as easily as you can use e-commerce platforms and buy the products of those same companies, allowing global investors to come and actually participate in the companies that they use every day. Fusang is headquartered in Labuan, and it's centered around the Fusang Exchange, which is licensed as a digital securities exchange. Today, I'm going to be talking a bit about Labuan and this home that Fusang has operated in for a long time. Why I think the digital side of Labuan is very interesting, because for both Fusang and across a greater group of companies, we hold a large slew of licenses in Labuan, including in the digital space. We act as trustees, as Farah was talking a bit about earlier. We explore digital banking, money broking, the securities exchange license I just mentioned, fund management, and etc. And Labuan has been a great home to us for many decades now. And part of the reason why I'm so excited about Labuan's future is precisely because I think that in this digital century, there are a huge number of benefits that Labuan can offer. I also sit both on the Fintech Association of Malaysia's Blockchain Committee, and I chair the Labuan Fintech Association, and that's the hat under which today I'm going to be talking to you as license holders, both in Labuan and in Qatar, about some of the exciting opportunities that Labuan can offer. If you can maybe go to the next slide. And I guess really the question is, why Labuan for digital entities? I think the interesting thing about digital in today's world is that a lot of geographical boundaries are beginning to dissolve. Certainly, as I mentioned, when it comes to something like e-commerce, today you no longer need to sell products only in your own jurisdiction. You can set up a widget manufacturer in Hong Kong and sell these products to the whole wide world. And in many cases, people are trying to do the same thing for digital financial services. But unlike e-commerce, you still need a jurisdictional home when it comes to being a licensed financial institution. And again, I understand that I think everyone on this call here today are industry players, either from Labuan or Qatar. I assume that you're on this call either because you already operate in one of these two jurisdictions, or you're interested in operating or maybe expanding your operations in one of these two jurisdictions. And I think you well understand that, again, in financial services, if you want to do things, you need licenses and you need to find yourself a regulator. And I think Labuan has proven in these last couple of years that it is a prime home for digital financial services. And that really begins with the approach that the Labuan Financial Services Authority has taken to the idea of how to approach regulating digital finance. You know, digital means different things to different people. In some cases, financial institutions are interested in being able to use digital channels, means of communication with clients. The idea that if you want to provide banking services to somebody, they no longer need to walk into a brick and mortar branch, that you can do this purely online. And there is a second category of financial institutions that are looking to offer very novel types of financial services, including companies like Fusang. Things like cryptocurrencies obviously are all the rage right now, but more generally, the idea of being able to digitize different kinds of financial instruments, things like security tokens, as I mentioned earlier, again, I think at the instrument level, that is very interesting to a lot of industry players. And I think Labuan has taken exactly the right approach, which is to say, instead of looking at the technology layer, the regulator should look at the underlying functional form. If you are, for example, a financial institution and you want to be a digital bank, or maybe you're an existing bank and you want to start providing digital services, as I mentioned, whether in terms of the channel or in terms of the underlying instrument, that the regulator should still treat you as a bank. And I think that this is a key differentiator with a lot of jurisdictions. Hong Kong, for example, there are multiple regulators here, and their approach from regulator to regulator has sometimes been highly divergent. Some regulators have chosen to look at the technology as something novel, and when it comes to issuing licenses, have chosen to issue brand new types of licenses, special rules and requirements. In Labuan, you can come and use the existing licensing and regulatory framework and get specifically approved to provide innovative financial services. Again, if you want to be a digital bank, you still need to comply with all of the usual banking requirements, but you'll be allowed to then do so in a very new and innovative way. This provides, I think, a huge amount of regulatory clarity in terms of, as an industry player, what are the rules that you need to follow. And I think it also leverages on Labuan's strength, which is, as Farah mentioned earlier, a whole framework in terms of rules, regulation, licensing, etc. Industry participants and investors on the other side of the table don't need to wait for new guidelines to come up, and they don't have a lack of certainty in terms of trying to decide or trying to figure out how regulators are going to treat a lot of these activities. If you can maybe go to the next slide. To show a bit in terms of the types of licenses that Labuan has. And again, this is some of the more digital side of the licenses. But if you want to operate, as Farah was mentioning, in a wide spectrum in the financial services ecosystem, I think Labuan has a license for you. And all of these things that you see here, again, they've got the word digital in front of them, but they're really trying to look at new activities and new channels under an existing licensing framework. So for example, if you want to operate a digital bank, as I said, you still need to comply with all of the usual banking requirements. And again, I hear from the industry in different jurisdictions that that's the single biggest roadblock to financial institutions adopting new digital technology, a lack of clarity and certainty about what digital rules could be or should be, and an awful lot of reading the tea leaves in a lot of jurisdictions. I don't think you need to worry about any of that in Labuan. And if you do have a new type of activity, a novel activity, my experience has been that the regulator is very open to having conversations about understanding what the underlying functional activity is, and then understanding how they can best fit that into the existing licensing and regulatory framework. If you could go to the next slide, please. As I understand, we're eating into our Q&A time, so I'll try and keep the rest of this quick, so we have plenty of time for questions, which is always the most interesting bit. But to give you an example, if you wanted to, for example, operate a crypto exchange and you decided that you want to set up a platform for trading Bitcoin. Again, Bitcoin as an actual underlying asset is unregulated in a lot of jurisdictions. And as a result, whether you could get licensed if you wanted to run a regulated platform to trade it, or if you were an existing licensed and regulated platform, whether you would be allowed to take that as a new activity and put it into your existing platform can be very ambiguous. Some regulators just say no. Some regulators say, please set up an unregulated activity to deal with something like Bitcoin, which is not optimal. Precisely because if you're a big financial institution, you do want to do things in a licensed and regulated fashion. Again, in Labuan, just to give you an example, if you wanted to set up a Bitcoin trading platform, you can go and apply for what's known as a money broking license. And you can come under all the same rules and regulations that you would need to comply with as though you were trading any other kind of currency or FX. Same reporting requirements, the Bank Negara, and etc. And in my experience, that ability both to leverage existing licenses and also tell your customers and investors, don't worry, these are not new things that regulators are trying to figure out. There is a clear set of rules that you can follow, gives investors a huge degree of comfort. And again, won't go too much into some of these examples, but hopefully you can start to see how using the existing licensing framework and licenses, you can do some very novel activities while still following all the same usual rules. And if you could maybe go to the last slide. Just to talk a bit about 2020, as Farah mentioned, Labuan has been growing in leaps and bounds, largely organically. There are a huge number of players coming to Labuan looking to leverage off this novel regulatory approach, as I said, using existing licenses for innovative financial and digital services. There have been a large number of people coming to the jurisdiction, so much so that I'm told that the regulators are actually a bit swamped under in terms of approving new license applications because there's such a sheer volume of people coming to the jurisdiction. And I believe that with this very exciting partnership with Qatar, there's going to be even more people between both jurisdictions wanting to come and learn more and better understand how they can leverage both of these jurisdictions and operate. And again, I think maybe just to make one final point, the really interesting thing about the Labuan framework is that in a lot of jurisdictions, even where they are looking to issue novel kinds of licenses, these tend to be at the margins. They will look at this for maybe fund management or maybe for brokerage activities. They're rarely willing to look at it for the quote-unquote big licenses. When it comes to something like banking or running a full-fledged securities exchange, most regulators are still very unsure in terms of how they want to progress. Whereas I can say for a fact that the Labuan regulators are very open to having discussions about really anything that you might be interested in setting up. And as long as you have that commitment to doing so in a fully regulated way, where you say, I am looking for a jurisdictional home that leverages all of the mutual benefits that Farah was talking about earlier, I really think that when it comes to Asia, at least as a location, you won't find a better place than Labuan. Anyway, thank you very much and looking forward to questions afterwards. I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Akber Khan from Rayan Investment. Akber, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. That was very, very interesting indeed. Just as an introduction, so I work for a investment company called Rayan Investment. I look after the asset management part of the business, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Qatar. What you really probably want to know is how can you get tickets to come to the World Cup next year? Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that either. But I do know that the FIFA website is probably where this is going to come from, because I get asked this question from friends all the time. So one of the interesting things about Qatar, and Henk mentioned it earlier, is that there's a lot of growth coming. As an investor, we focus on how visible that growth is, and it is incredibly visible, and there is a lot of growth. So that makes it relatively interesting and unique. So if we go to the next slide, please, what we can see on this is splitting up the growth over the last 3 years, the last 4 years, both in terms of the hydrocarbon growth, which in Qatar's case is largely gas rather than oil, and then the non-hydrocarbon growth, which is in brown. So you can see that the hydrocarbon growth on a quarterly basis, as it's shown, sort of goes up and down and is partly driven by what happens to oil prices and production. The brown is probably more interesting in terms of the diversification of the economy, and you can see that that's been very healthy. And then COVID happened, and it obviously is recovering sharply. But the blockade that Henk talked about was from June 2017. So you can see that Qatar did actually extremely well despite the blockade. And the blue line is to show the credit rating. So it was downgraded from AA to AA minus soon after the blockade began, and it's been there throughout. So it's a very, very strong credit. This is S&P's rating. If you go to the next slide, please. So what the earlier slide shows is that with a developed market style credit rating, we have emerging market style growth. What this slide shows is comparing Qatar's position in terms of its sensitivity to the oil price versus the rest of the region. So what this question is, what the slide is trying to answer the question in terms of what Brent crude price is needed to balance the government budget. So how much is spending relative to income? So for Qatar for 2021, the oil price, the Brent price based on IMF forecasts needs to be at $43 average to balance the budget. Year to date, we're at 67 is the average. So on that basis, the UAE and Kuwait should probably balance their books as well. Qatar will have a massive surplus, and some of the other countries will be will have less deficits than they had originally expected. So Qatar has historically always had a far lower break-even, just because of the very large wealth that the country has relative to its size. If we go to the next slide, this shows a little bit more about the LNG expansion and how this is talking about the very visible and very high growth that's coming over the course of the coming decade. The gold bars show LNG production, which is on the axis on the left-hand side in terms of millions of tons a year. And you can see that in 2009, 2010, 2011, there were big jumps, which took the current LNG production to 77 million tons per year, which made Qatar the largest exporter of LNG in the world. And that is equivalent to about 3 million barrels of oil a day in terms of if you look at it, barrels of oil equivalent. What you can also see is the brown line, which is the nominal GDP of the country, unsurprisingly, is pretty closely correlated to the gold bars. So as LNG production increases, GDP goes up. So it's been in the range of about $170 to $200 billion of GDP per year for the last decade, really. Obviously gone up and down with the oil price. But what's interesting is the gray bars that are towards the right-hand side of this chart, which is there is a two-stage LNG expansion on the cards. It's well underway now, and by the end of it, by the end of 2027, probably 2028, there will be a 64% expansion in LNG production in Qatar. This is a $45 to $50 billion project, and this will mean that GDP will jump considerably relative to where it is right now, and it's very clear, it's very visible. If we go to the next slide. So over the last decade, Qatar spent about $300 billion, or an average of about $500 million a week in building the country. That build out was accelerated because in December 2010, Qatar won the rights to host the FIFA World Cup in 2022. So that event will start on the 21st of November next year, and it will finish on the 18th of December. So essentially what that tournament did was to fast forward a lot of the build out that would have probably been done over 20 or 25 years, and it was accelerated all to finish before the end of next year, or before the World Cup begins next year. So there is a metro station was built from scratch. A metro network was built from scratch with dozens of stations. It's all underground largely. There's local roads, highways, a port, an airport, huge expansion in electricity generation, water desalination. Lots of schools and universities were built, hospitals, housing, real estate developments, lots of leisure facilities, the build out from 4G to 5G, and obviously the expansion of oil and gas. All that has happened already, but there is still a lot more to come. And the table, or the table on the right, essentially highlights some of the areas where there is still development. I mentioned the gas expansion. There is a lot more to come. And over the coming years, we still see north of $100 billion of capex based on what's currently been announced. There's potentially more to come as well. So that's about the continued spending. If we go to the next slide, this is really focusing on what will be much more in the news next year. These are the World Cup stadiums. The one which is on the top left was the one that existed already. It's been refurbished. The other 6 are all brand new, and the one on the bottom right, which is a little bit bigger, is the one where the final will be hosted. That's in a place called Lusail. So this is a pretty interesting World Cup because the longest distance between two stadiums, the longest distance is 75 kilometers. So it's very compact. It's more like an Olympics all in one city, whereas in the World Cup in Russia, the longest distance between two stadiums was a 5.5-hour flight. So it'll be pretty interesting. And because it's all going to be in one place, you will have 500,000, 1 million visitors potentially coming to a country of 2.5 million people in a 2, 3, 4 week period. So the economic impact of this is going to be extraordinary. And unlike any other World Cup, because in other World Cups, the visitors have come, but they've been spread out across many, many cities over large countries. So this is going to be interesting in terms of the economic impact and the investment impact, which is obviously what we look at as fund managers. If we go to the next slide, please. Just a quick summary of the institution that I work for. So Al Rayan Investment is a subsidiary of an Islamic bank in Qatar, which is called Masraf Al Rayan. The parent is about 50% owned by Qatari government and government entities. It's listed on the local stock exchange. Al Rayan Investment is a QFC company and has been since 2007. We do two things, which is asset management and advisory or investment banking. On asset management, we focus on equities within the Gulf, and also we do sukuk globally. Everything we do is Sharia compliant, and we manage in excess of $1 billion. That includes the second largest Sharia compliant equity ETF in the world, which the ticker is QATR, which is a great way of accessing Qatar because it invests in an index of 25 Sharia compliant Qatari stocks. Also, we manage something called the Al Rayan GCC fund, which is a great way of getting exposure to the region, particularly in an environment where oil prices are at, Brent prices are around $80 at the moment. Aluminium, fertilizer, lots of petrochemicals are at multi-year highs. So for the region as a whole, while the world does not enjoy high commodity prices, as a commodity producing region, this is a very profitable time for Qatar and the region as a whole at present. And obviously, there is the Expo starting very close to us in the next few days, and there are a number of projects, significant projects, with tens or hundreds of billions of dollars happening in Saudi as well. So our fund, GCC fund, is able to give access to all of these long-term growth themes as well. That's all I wanted to highlight. I thought I'd keep it short and sweet, so there's some time to ask questions. And I've already answered the one about where do we get World Cup tickets from, which is I'm not sure. Thank you.
Thank you, speakers. So we have our first question for Farah. The most interesting segment in Qatar that might have, let's say, the aspiration and ambition to grow in Southeast Asia or in other areas of the globe are probably the national champions. So we're not only talking about the gas and oil companies, but also, let's say, the infrastructure of gas and oil exports, also the national champions in the financial sector. And so for those tier one national champions and the big family conglomerates, what are the most relevant features and possibilities Labuan IBFC has to offer? Farah, please.
I'd like to think that for the more established entities, be them in Qatar or anywhere really, the beauty of Labuan is that everything can be centralized. So obviously, if you are a large conglomerate, you'll have different legs in different areas of business, different needs, different requirements. Some very, very corporate and structured, old school almost. Like, for example, you would need some kind of bond issuance or some kind of debt financing or even a private fund. You know, Labuan ticks the boxes in all those areas. And then if, for example, you would need for the matriarch or the patriarch or the founder of the head of the family, some kind of a business succession, asset preservation vehicle, we also have things like the private trust company, we have the private foundations. And it's quite interesting, I spoke earlier about the protected cell company that is now being actively used as a family office due to its bankruptcy remoteness of each cell. And then if, let's say, you were to have a startup that's venturing into some kind of digital space, you would also have a license that's available or a corporate structure that's available that you can use in Labuan. So really, you know, I don't like to say one-stop shop, you know, in that sense, but in a way, it gives you that comfort to know that you are being regulated by one regulator that understands all this. And in the wholesale financial services that we're in, the bespoke element and the relationship with the regulator is of utmost importance. So the regulator will understand you as a conglomerate. I think that is one of the key benefits of being in Labuan. And let's not forget the idea of substance being able to be centralized in one place. So you're not going to different jurisdictions, setting up a structure and trying to ensure that you meet their substance requirements, because what you have is a centralized entity or centralized management of substance via your different licenses.
Thank you, Farah. So we have a second question for Henk. I think it's clear that Qatar has an impressively clear growth outlook for the decades to come. So where do you see most opportunities for Malaysian corporates and institutions in this growth narrative?
But yeah, obviously it is a growth story, and as Akber also clearly pointed out, there is lots of money. So I think in general for Malaysia, given the fact two Islamic countries, I would say there are great opportunities on the Islamic finance front. We can honestly learn a lot from Malaysia in general, so we were trying to develop an Islamic finance roadmap here, where we would like the local corporates to make use of corporate sukuk and corporate issuances. That part of is not really developed because the banks are basically facilitating all the lending in the country, yeah. So that part, if Malaysian companies are active or the one institution are active on that front, we can learn a lot, and we need your knowledge and expertise. This morning I had a talk with ETIS Ventures, which is a Labuan institution, quite advanced in crowdfunding, specifically to promote financial inclusion and make sure that that money gets to people that otherwise have difficulties in getting funding. That would be a great example. That unfortunately cannot be regulated by us. We need to be regulated by the central bank, but we try to help as much as possible to open up that space. So that is a clear example. But I think in general, obviously, if there are production companies, you know, and you would like to set up here in the cover-free zone, physical things, logistics, expertise, that's one area for Malaysian companies. And the other one is clearly the financial sector, and specifically the Islamic finance sector. I hope that answers the question.
If I can add to that, the other big area which Malaysia has done a phenomenal job over the last several decades, which Qatar seeks, I guess, partners, advice, etc., is on tourism and leisure activities. Qatar has big ambitions in terms of increasing the number of tourists that come to Qatar and the number of visitors that come to Qatar. Once they're here, they need to do things. They need to stay in places. They need to eat food. They need to have fun. They need to do all the things that you would do. So there's been huge developments over the last several years on all of these fronts. But clearly the expertise and experience of Malaysian entities in these, or I guess they don't have to be Malaysian, they just have to be based in, you know, if you have non-Malaysian entities in Labuan that have expertise, that's what's needed. So, you know, Qatar and the Gulf has a lot to learn from the quality of hospitality and tourist experience that happens in Asia.
Thank you, Akber. And so my next question is actually to Akber. And as Henk mentioned in his answer, Islamic finance is a focus area for potential cooperation, because Qatar is home to some of the most respected financial institutions in the region, while Malaysia is a recognized center of expertise in this area. So what is, according to you, the opportunities as well as challenges?
So, look, I think globally, Islamic finance is significantly underpenetrated relative to where it should be, and where just from the perspective of how large the Muslim population is as a part of the world, and how small Islamic finance is as a percent of global finance. There is you know, if Islamic finance was 5 times bigger than it is, it would still be underpenetrated. So the question is not about Qatar and Malaysia in isolation. It's a bigger question about Islamic finance. So the point is, if we are to sort of pull Islamic finance by you know, if it get its act together, so to speak, you need some players to drive that process forward. It's not going to happen by itself. So with Qatar being having ambitions of you know, financial being a financial center in the region, Malaysia obviously is, the Islamic finance credentials are well known to everybody. You need people to sort of galvanize the process and drive it forward. So if there was the ability for you know, institutions, whether that's at a company level or regulatory bodies at Islamic level, to sort of come together and bring the Gulf and you know, the Asian centers together. Those are the 2 Islamic finance hubs globally. If they can cooperate rather than compete, that would pave the way for huge amounts of growth that both of them would enjoy as a result. So I think it's about trying to find ways to open up, to harmonize, to reduce the areas of reduce the bottlenecks in Islamic finance. And there are a number of different areas. I don't want to necessarily go into the details, but from what is the definition of Sharia compliant through to different products, through to how to the ability for Islamic finance to have an intersection with ESG, which it does have an intersection, and that is obviously a focus globally. There's a big subset of the S, which in ESG with Islamic finance already has been doing for many, many years. So I think it's just about trying to be smarter rather than having to revolutionize anything, and try and find avenues of to work together.
So my last question is to Henry. So we actually listened to your presentation with admiration because of the regulatory environment you have showcased. And also in that area, I think we have a lot to learn from Malaysia and from Labuan. So my last question is, how can we attract more fintech companies from Malaysia, and particularly the Islamic fintech companies from Malaysia, to set up and explore growth opportunities in Qatar and the wider region? Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, I can tell you, as a young fintech company and holding a whole bunch of different licenses in Labuan, one thing that I'm particularly excited about is the proposed mutual recognition of licensed entities between both Labuan and Qatar. Like it or not, if you undertake certain activities in different jurisdictions, you need to get licensed. So I think as a first step, having players in each jurisdiction understand how they can operate in the other jurisdiction is going to be very interesting. I think the flip side of that is, as much as you, the institution, need to be licensed, you also need to understand the nature of the activities you conduct, how that's going to work in the other jurisdiction, right? Because how we operate in the regulatory environment is not just licenses. It's, as Farah was mentioning, all of these different frameworks and an understanding built up over time between the industry and the regulator of how exactly to operate and what the contours of that look like. So I think that if Labuan and Qatar together can help players in each jurisdiction understand, if I'm going to undertake activity A over here, this is how it maps onto this same activity or this same regulatory framework in the other jurisdiction. And if we can achieve that common shared understanding of how to interoperate, let's call it, I think that's incredibly exciting, actually. I don't know of a lot of jurisdictions out there in the world, certainly not jurisdictions that are as innovative as Labuan and Qatar, who are looking at these kind of programs. And I think it'll be a massive selling point for both jurisdictions to say you can set up both in the Gulf and in the Asian region, and all of a sudden you can bridge both worlds by operating in one or the other location.
So I would like to thank all of you again for your great input and great insights. And thank you everyone for joining us. And with this, we will conclude this webinar. Thanks a lot, everyone.